this guy than the last three. But if as we said earlier, if you had watch tomorrow, I'd have watch tomorrow. Yeah.
Paul, Conte and Mourinho were out and out winners.
Mourinho were out and out winners. They didn't show
You'd rather have Ange than Conte and Mourinho? Seriously?
100%.
Oh my God.
Mourinho and Conte.
Oh my God, I'm sorry. Mate.
Hello and welcome to Tottenham Hotspur, a revolutionary new Spurs podcast, all about Spurs podcasts. It's a stupid idea, but so what? You can blame my friends on Blue Sky telling me that they would listen to this idea for me sitting here and rambling into a microphone in my spare bedroom in my house in beautiful Rockville, Maryland, here in the United States. The podcast is all about dissecting and talking about and thinking about how Spurs fans represent themselves to other Spurs fans through podcasts. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's silly, but it's always interesting in my opinion. You know, from my perspective, I've been a Spurs fan since the late 80s. My dad was a Spurs fan, my older brother's a Spurs fan, and I talk a lot with them about Spurs. But more often than not, with them and with my friends in the pub, it always comes back to, did you listen to the latest episode of The Fighting Cock? Or The View from the Lane? Or The Extra Inch? Or I'm telling people about new Tottenham podcasts I'm discovering, like The Tottenham Depot, or Wicked Spursy, or something else, right? So this is a really sort of high energy area of the Spurs fandom. And given how much, Sky Sports and other media companies are taking note and inviting these podcasters onto their shows, it just proves how important this whole area is and how influential they are in reflecting back to the Spurs fan base what we're thinking and feeling, but also what type of people we are. You know, what are our values? What annoys us? What brings us joy? So that's kind of what I'm thinking with all of this. And like I said, I'd love for somebody to come on and share this space with me. You don't have to have recording equipment. You just need to have a podcast that is either stuck in your teeth or is really bringing you a lot of happiness at the moment. So this week I was all ready to talk about The Fighting Cock. It's multiverse, it's characters, it's cast of characters, some chat about its history. And so I was gearing up. There was the main pod this week, there was a Q&A with Ricky, there was a lab episode with Dan Kilpatrick. But as I was listening through, trying to listen to as many Spurs pods as I could this week, just in anticipation of recording this pile of crap that I'm currently making, I listened to Last Word On Spurs for the first time in months, and it was just way too interesting to put down. It was stuck in my brain like a worm. So, I'm going to pivot from all of my excitement about The Fighting Cock into a podcast that I never listened to, really. I've got a lot of respect for Last Word On Spurs. It's been going for 8 years now, started in 2017. It's had millions of downloads. There are tens of thousands of listeners every week. The stream that I listened to on Tuesday, I guess it was recorded in the wake of the Fulham loss, had 50,000 people listening. And that was the reaction pod, titled Insipid Tottenham Suffered Defeat, which is really putting it out there exactly how Ricky was feeling. Ricky, the host of the show, Ricky Sachs, is a really nice guy. He's so affable. I'm so impressed at how his energy can be so high. It's truly impressive what he's built from going from, his bedroom to influencing hundreds of thousands of Spurs fans now. The show on the whole has a real bloke in the pub energy, but it really depends on what pub you're going to, whether or not that vibes with you or not. If you're going to a pub and there's a bloke who's 10 pints deep and he's yelling about his opinions on Ange Postecoglou, that may just not be for you. Or you might be looking to go for a fight. So a bloke in the pub energy is a blessing and a curse. But my whole sort of sense with these podcasts, where the aim is to translate that, conversation in a bar or around a mate's house into a radio show, is why not just go to a pub and have those conversations with your friends yourself? And maybe that's something that I can sort of think about later if I remember it. So there were 2 Last Word on Spurs pods this week that I listened to. Again, both of these were following on from progress in Europe and another defeat in the Premier League. The reaction pod was an eye-opener. I'll try to keep this brief, because quite frankly, we don't need a podcast about a podcast in the first place, let alone one with a 3-hour runtime. Because if I were to go blow by blow, I would be here until like middle of next week. The runtime of Last Word on Spurs is ridiculous. It was 2 hours and 7 minutes, including adverts, and a 2-minute introduction of the We Are Tottenham Hotspur video, which is narrated by Roger Lloyd-Pack. That really kind of manipulative, we are the 30-yard free kick video that gets shown and shared every now and then. Really sort of makes the hairs on the back of your neck tingle thing, but I don't understand why it's the introduction to Last Word on Spurs. It kind of feels manipulative, trying to amp the listener up, ready for this battle of wits between these folks. And the folks on the show are really interesting. There was a first-timer, another guy named Ian, as well as several regulars. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of the voices on Last Word on Spurs, because I'm not super familiar with the show and because they rotate so often, they're just, guy number 1, guy number 2, guy number 3. And I apologize if I'm not going to give you the best description here. Something I'll say about Last Word on Spurs is that bloke on the pub energy gets a lot from these people who are very raw, very emotional, especially after a defeat. And it takes a lot of guts to go onto a very well-listened podcast without any training, without, I don't know what kind of notes they're given going into this thing. So this kind of every person approach is impressive, and it takes guts. It's something that you have to really applaud in some ways, to take that kind of lack of experience and put yourself out there. But it also takes a lot of guts to flash somebody, or to let a Rottweiler do your taxes, and I'm pretty sure that I'm not supposed to be applauding that. So maybe it's not as good a thing as I think it is. So the other one guy who dominated proceedings, Ian, was incandescent with rage. He was quick to point out how Ange was, awful. He needs to go. We need to get rid of him as soon as possible. And if I'm honest, that's a real mirror up to the fan base, or at least a portion of the fan base. I don't know what it says about me as a person where I don't quite vibe with that, but it's quite refreshing to hear somebody just lay it out there in as a clear way as they can. They are unhappy and they are not willing to be persuaded from that viewpoint. And I know that sounds strange, but there's just something about that vibe on Last Word on Spurs of people who are just willing to dig in. That is super interesting. I'm not sure I'm the person to really get into it, and maybe if I'm a little bit more experienced of actually talking about podcasts, maybe it'll be better. Maybe I'll get better. I don't know. But anyway, so there was fight after fight, and something about the runtime, the first hour felt very different to the second hour of Last Word on Spurs, the reaction pod. It was almost like there was this switch that went where their energy levels dropped or their guard diminished of the guests on the show. And there was a lot more fights in the second half, in the second hour of Last Word on Spurs. And I can't help but feel like maybe that's why the show is so long, because everyone's kind of nice to each other in the first hour. They're They're kind of polite. They're respecting each other. But as they hear more and more of these challenging opinions from one another, they start to clash. And that's when you start hearing like sound bites that are clipped up and shared on X or wherever. But even though they're these guys who are having this kind of knockdown, drag out fight about Spurs and about where we're at and whether we should stick with Postecoglou and whether he's any good or whether he's not any good, they were so quick to point out that they really weren't mad at each other frequently in that second hour, even though it really sounded like they were. And just to kind of wrap up the whole reaction pod, I think it was summed up by Ricky Sachs, who said later in the episode, "We finally agreed on something after an hour and 31 minutes." And I think it was about Pochettino. This show was a very interesting shaggy dog story about life as a Tottenham fan at the moment. But yeah, they just couldn't find a middle ground. The Tuesday pod was a lot more relaxed. It was titled Postecoglou Under Pressure, hyphen Pochettino wants return, hyphen Iriola top target, hyphen Frank/Silva on the shortlist. Real succinct stuff. Much less chaotic, but it had some interesting quotes, and I'll just quickly run through those so that I can save myself from sat here talking into a microphone for 2 hours. There was support for Ange if he wins the Europa League, which feels, very kind. One guy wanted to bring in Ryan Mason as soon as possible, which is just beautiful chef's kiss. There was a list of damning statistics read out by Ricky after about 30 minutes, which is just an interesting way for the host to grab hold and set a narrative for an entire episode. And in fact, if I just compare Ricky Sachs from the Tuesday pod to the reaction pod after the Fulham game, he was a lot more influential in the conversation on Tuesday. And I don't know if that's a regular feature of Last Word on Spurs episodes, where the reaction pods tend to be a little bit more chaotic. And Ricky has a much greater influence on midweek pods. Looping back to some of my other points here, I've got one guy saying, "Give me 1-0 wins over excitement," and then following up with, "We seem to be stuck in a managerial cycle every 18 months. Absolutely zero hint of recognition that those 2 points are kind of linked. If we're constantly flip-flopping between wanting excitement and then wanting pragmatic football, we can't have both, and we'll constantly be cycling out new managers." Somebody asked whether the league matters anymore. And then the last thing that caught my eye was a new Tottenham phrase that I haven't heard before, which was one guy saying, "We can Tottenham this up," which seems like a way of not saying Spursy, quite frankly. So overall this week, Last Word on Spurs was... it was interesting. It occupied way too much of my life. With the 4 hours that I spent watching or listening to Last Word on Spurs, I could have watched, Dune, or I could have gone for a walk out in the countryside. I could have done anything other than listening to, in the first, the reaction pod, people going at each other with hammer and tongs. Overall though, Last Word on Spurs is one of those podcasts that I don't engage with a ton. It's something that I'll look to if I've run out of my favorite podcasts and I just need some Spurs content. I very rarely look for it myself after a win or after a loss. And I think it's because it occupies an interesting half space in the Spurs podosphere, where it's kind of neither really about solid, good, insightful analysis of a game. And in fact, I would say that there was very little analysis that happened in the 4 hours of Last Word on Spurs I listened to this week of the actual tactics and players on the pitch, apart from just kind of opinions about who's good, who's not good. So it's neither between, as a podcast, it's neither about good, insightful tactical analysis or truly novel and interesting opinions, because a lot of what you're hearing from these people are stuff that you can see on social media. There's no sort of new commentary on Spurs fandom or Spurs as a team. And that's kind of a shame because they have a big platform where this can be shared. And maybe this isn't true of every week, but after listening to, many hours of it this week, I didn't hear anything that I didn't know already. And that could also speak to just where Tottenham are as a club at the moment, where we're in a bit of a weird Groundhog Day. So yeah, I mean, who's it for this week? I would say that if you are a Levy out and an Enoch out and an Ange out person, that reaction pod is for you. 5 stars. You've got one guy who is fighting his corner and you're saying everything that the most, not extreme, but the most full-on Levy and Ange out person will be saying. There was some pushback frequently from people, pointing out the good stuff that Ange has done, pointing out that he deserves more time if he gets some wins together, pointing out that Levy has done some good things. But overall, the dominant focus of Last Word on Spurs this week was disappointment, as you might expect. And speaking of disappointment, the last words of Last Word on Spurs is, "Come on, you Spurs." And I was hoping for something slightly more provocative, quite frankly, like "help me" or "Levy in," something really just to get people's blood boiling. Moving on now to the lightning round of the other podcasts that I listened to this week. I'll try to zip through these quickly because we're at 16 minutes and I can't believe I've talked this long about effing Spurs podcasts. All right, first up, I listened to The Fighting Cock, 3 episodes this week, if you include the lab. Pretty somber stuff. I would say this is safe for Ange out people, maybe not so much for people who are Ange in. I like the guests who were on, especially I like Ricky and Flav. I like their dynamic together. I don't really listen to Lads Anonymous, but it's pretty good, I hear. Thelonious Filth was on. He's a very sort of calm head in the Fighting Cock realm, so I like listening to that. Another one of the guests on one of the shows this week was Jack Hussey of Rule the Roost fame. I love Jack's reaction pods. It's something that I listen to every week, so I always recommend listening to the reaction pods. He also had a good midweek show too, with some interesting comments on Ange's time at Australia and his use of social media and the way that he presented himself. I would say that generally speaking, this was an Ange out favourable show, or at least friendly show. And I will also applaud Jack's ability to do the man on the mic thing week in and week out after having done it now for 20 minutes and having about 50 different versions of this that I've already deleted. It's tough. The Extra Inch. You know what the Extra Inch is. It's for tactics pervs. If you are listening to Spurs podcasts this week and you are itching for somebody to kind of dissect why it's gone wrong so far, it's for the Extra Inch. That's what you're looking for. There was no Bardi this week. Happy birthday, Bardi. If you're listening, which you're probably not. This is really, it's Ange out at the moment. They desperately want it to work, but it really is. It's safe for Ange out only people, I'd say. Unless you're a regular listener, you might be. If you're Ange in, you know what you're getting. A podcast I don't really hear people talking about all that much is Wicked Spursy. This is run by Vermont Spurs, official supporters clubs here in the US. It's just kind of general chat, nice guys, kind of relaxed pace. I would say that they were pretty balanced on the Ange in and Ange out crowd. And if you're into beer, they had a lengthy section on what they were drinking whilst recording the podcast, which can always be fun and just gives it a different dynamic, I feel. The Game is About Glory. I feel like I'm underselling them by saying this, but they really are the most balanced pod out there at the moment. It's the one that if somebody's never listened to a Spurs podcast before, I'd recommend they listen to. It's almost like having a soothing bath after going through a Tough Mudder or listening to 4 hours of Last Word on Spurs in a row. Really good podcast. Ange out folks may not be enjoying it at the moment, because I generally say that the blokes on there are focusing on the positives. Whether that's where I'm at the moment, I'm not so sure that Ange will still be here next year. I think he's got until the summer at least, but they're sort of leaning towards supporting Ange. The Tottenham Depot, it's another American podcast. I like them. I like their approach. Their biggest selling point to me is that they cover both the men's and women's teams, which is like refreshing. But the problem is both teams suck at the moment. So there's no respite from the misery at times. Their second biggest selling point, I'd say, is that they're pretty well balanced, and they get their pods out quickly on a Sunday after a men's game. And I'd say that they're pretty welcoming to both Ange in and Ange out people. I'm not saying they are Ange in or Ange out, but I think that both crowds would have a good time. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up with The View from the Lane. You know what you're getting. It's Danny Kelly excelling at being Danny Kelly. At one point, he was making an argument that passing is always better than running the ball, and that he could pass a ball forward quicker than Mickey van der Ven could run it. And I understand what he's saying, but it just feels really churlish to be comparing the two. There was a new contributor this week, Elias Burke, who seems to be a new beat writer for Spurs at The Athletic. And generally speaking, The View from the Lane is really only safe for Ange out people or sickos like me who have a high pain tolerance for Danny Kelly. So where are we at? What's going on with Spurs pods, and what does it say about Spurs fandom at the moment? After the hours and hours of Spurs podcasts I listened to this week, I would say that I was really surprised about how no one pod, apart from the Extra Inch, which is kind of their thing, really wanted to talk about the games. Anything positive about Alkmaar was hand-waved away as not being quite good enough. And everything that went wrong with Fulham was attributed entirely to, the manager. There was a lot of talk about, other teams and how they're doing. How's Fulham doing with their coach? What's Areola up to? Bournemouth. Let's compare, to ourselves to Arsenal, to Manchester United. And it's really kind of, it's not disappointing, but there's very little focus on what Spurs are doing so much as what others have. A grass is kind of greener approach. Again, a lot of talk about other managers. I mentioned Areola. I mentioned Marco Silva. Thomas Frank came up. But also former managers. There's been a lot of discussion this week about Maurizio Pochettino because of the photograph of him and Daniel Levy at some swanky bistro, which I'm sure is very nice. I'm sure they do some great eggs. And yeah, it's just kind of disappointing, that it's these people all have jobs, and yeah, it can be fun to lean into the conversation, but Ange's still in position. We've got 3 months of the season still to go. It's just kind of I don't know, a little gauche. A lot of talk about former Spurs teams, namely Pochettino's Spurs teams, but also Redknapp's. There was also, beer talk came up a few times. Fighting Cock talked a lot about infidelity in their Q&A show with Ricky and Flav. And obviously, the Game is About Glory had some thigh-rubbing discussions, I think, this week, if you like that kind of thing. Which you can. Nothing wrong with that. So, if you listen to just one pod this week, I think I would recommend... If you're Anjin, I'd say you should go for The Game is About Glory. That's going to be your safe space this week. If you're Ange out, it really depends on how angry you are. If you're want to put your face through a window, then maybe Last Word on Spurs' reaction pod is going to give you what you need. But if you're looking for something more balanced, I'd say maybe Rule the Roost. So that's the kind of quality you can expect from me, by the way, is that I said that I would recommend one podcast, and then I mentioned 3. So that's it. That was my weekend podcasts. We're reaching the 25-minute mark. This was weird and a lot of fun, and please come on and give me somebody to bounce off of. I love podcasts. I love Tottenham. I love Spurs fans. That's kind of my main thing. I love the wild and annoying and passionate and funny group that Spurs fans are globally. You know, somebody tells you they're a Spurs fan, you know their personality, you know what types of things they like, especially if they've, picked up the club as a grown up. You know, if you're born into it, there's a different sort of set of characteristics, but this is important, I think. I'm doing good work. Yeah, I can convince myself I'm doing good work here. Important work. So yeah, reach out to me. We've got social media. I will link it in the show notes because I've forgotten it already. I think it's Tottenham Hotspur at Blue Sky, or you can follow me at ian.coyce.social. That's Ian spelled IAIN, because my parents hate me. Yeah, keep listening to Spurs podcasts. Keep making Spurs podcasts. And, at some point we'll probably have Spurs podcasts about Spurs podcasts about Spurs podcasts at some point. So thank you for listening, and keep commenting on Spurs.